we're missing information here, particularly post the ordinance. So it's good to show our work. I always say that. And it's a bit incomplete just through no fault of your own. You're collecting the data, but that is missing. And I think it's important to point out because it's not painting as clear a picture as we would like.
Well, that's Councilmember Maritza Rivera at the Public Safety Committee meeting this week as the council wrestles with some mixed news and a report that's not fully complete about how effective the city's recently revised public drug consumption ordinance is. Plus, how much information should Seattle police share with federal authorities who are cracking down on immigration, another thorny issue for the city of Seattle to wrestle with? And did you hear? The Seahawks won the Super Bowl. True story. A huge win for the team and maybe for your bank account? Well, all this and more on this edition of Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I am a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine. And I am back with my friend and co-host, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. David, was that you I heard screaming out, Seahawks, down at Pike Place Market after the Super Bowl win? What was your assignment for the Times?
Yeah, just like that was me climbing up the telephone pole or whatever. Yeah. My assignment, I was at my house, so I wasn't out in the streets, but I was I was taking feeds from the field and got to compile them into a, Seattle Celebrates kind of story. So, it was fun to get to be part of the coverage.
Indeed it was. And what a win. So awesome. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on the show. Thank you, David. Thanks also to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso, on the first floor of City Hall. And thanks to the patrons of the show. A special Patrons First podcast is in your inbox this week. I'm talking with State Representative Chapalo Street from the 37th District about the controversial millionaire's tax plan, focusing on building more homes in commercial areas and a lot more. Patrons, that is an episode for you. You get it before anybody else does. Just one of many benefits when you support the show. A big shout out to Scott for signing up to be a patron this past week. Scott, I'm going to be sending you a Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal very soon. Keep an eye out for that, and thank you for the support. Giving levels start at just $5 a month. That's Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Thanks also for watching this podcast on Converge Media. The video version is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's go. Time for Right Here, Right Now. David, I thought it was an interesting meeting of the Public Safety Committee on Tuesday morning as council members were learning more about how the city's public drug use ordinance has been performing since the council revisited it and made some changes to it back in 2023. These were subtle changes, but basically, the instruction to police was this: make an arrest on knowing possession or use of a drug in public only if there's a threat of harm to the community. Also, the plan was that diversion and treatment would be the preferred alternatives to booking somebody into jail. And the numbers show, I'm not sure what at this point. There were apparently more arrests and more diversions, but even the Office of the Inspector General, which made this report, admitted the diversion data were not completely accurate. They couldn't get police and let everyone achieve with dignity who oversee these diversion efforts. They couldn't come up with similar numbers. I just wanted to put it out there, David. What did this report say to you?
Yeah, it told me that we need to do a better job of understanding what exactly our policies are or aren't doing. I mean, well, the first thing is the vagueness of the directives. And maybe that's necessary because, I think policing requires a lot of discretion. But, when you talk about a community threat or whatever that is, and then you look at what falls under that, the parameters are quite broad and vague, and it would be hard to... I think you could probably make that argument that something is or isn't a community threat in probably most situations.
Yeah, and just to jump in here, I saw the council asking about this. It's like, okay, if it's close to a school, if it's close to a transit stop, there's a lot of places in Seattle that are close to places like that. And I think that makes it a rather broad directive, like you say, for Seattle police.
Or, even on like blocking a sidewalk or something like that, that could be a community threat. And I think we've seen this throughout this kind of debate around this drug ordinance, is that it does leave a lot of discretion to the police. And that, as a result, means how the police perceive what the result of their arrest is going to be, correctly or not, sometimes has an influence on how many arrests they're actually making. If they don't believe that it's going to move through the system and be prosecuted, police a lot of the time might just not bother making the arrest. So, I mean, that's one piece of it. As far as just the lack of information, I think this is a general frustration. The Department of Public Defense came out with this report, it was kind of late last year, around how many people who were being booked into jail were actually getting treatment. And they, their conclusion was not that many, and this was sort of a critical report of the drug ordinance. The folks like at the mayor's office and even at Lead countered that that's not a very good way of looking at it because just a vast majority of people are being diverted before they even get there and are making connections. But the reason I think in some ways that's not satisfying is because we just don't have a lot of view into that world. So, if 1,000 people come into contact with a police officer for allegedly violating this drug ordinance, pretty good chance that like 800 of them are going to be diverted or have some contact with Lead. And so if you're talking about 80% of these cases, we don't really have a great sense of what's happening there. That isn't particularly good. I think some of this is just the fact that you have this sort of, in some ways, awkward crossover between government and something like the Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Program or whatever its acronym is now, which is written into the drug diversion law. And so I just think that the city, and, I think people at Lead would probably agree with this, the city and Lead need to kind of streamline their communications and operations a little bit better. So if we are going to lean on Lead in as heavily as, Katie Wilson and Erica Evans and the whole city council has said that we should also expect more insight into what actually is happening when Lead workers are interacting with drug users.
I think that's fair. And I think there was some question, too, about in terms of when people actually go through this Lead process. Is it a referral from a police officer? Is it a referral from somebody in the community? There's a number of different ways they can go through the program. So that was a point of contention, too. Just last touch on this. As you know, this was a measure passed by the prior council, this drug diversion ordinance here. The prior city attorney was in power, too. I'm wondering if it's something you could see the council or the mayor tweaking further, or maybe that's not the best move because clearly the data isn't all there yet. What do you think happens next here? That's my question.
Yeah, I don't know. That would be a pretty big political risk to tweak it. And then, something, maybe the numbers get worse. And, so I don't know. I haven't heard any talk about wanting to tweak the drug ordinance. Again, though, because there is so much kind of discretion in this world, I think what we have seen is what's already happened in some ways. When Erica Evans issued that directive, I think it was on her first day in office, saying, cases should be referred to Lead. In some ways, what she was doing was just reiterating the law as it already was. And in her interpretation, the previous administration was not really enforcing it to the letter of the law. Of course, the message of that got kind of mangled and turned into police, again, says no, don't address people for drug use. Wasn't exactly that.
Right.
So, I think I would be surprised if there was, any desire to reopen that ordinance. But I think there's a lot of latitude and movement around how it is followed and how it's enforced and how it's interpreted.
Fair enough. A related topic here that was also in the Public Safety Committee that I think really harkens to some of these issues with police as well. But I did want to talk about this measure sponsored by Councilmember Maritza Rivera regarding how Seattle police are expected to interact with federal immigration officers. This is another issue in this committee here, a measure that would prohibit police or other city employees from providing non-publicly available personal information for use in civil immigration enforcement. Here's some backstory, folks. In 1986, the council passed a measure that directed officers and employees to cooperate with and not to hinder federal immigration enforcement. This was based on a local initiative passed by voters. That changed in 2003. The city created this requirement that officers and employees not inquire or attempt to determine the immigration status of any person. Then in 2018, during the first Trump administration, there was a mayoral directive directing city departments to refer federal government requests to the mayor's legal team. So a lot going on here, David. I just wanted to get your take on this about where we are now with this proposal from Councilmember Rivera. What would her ordinance actually change? What do you see coming out of this if indeed the council does pass it?
Yeah, as far as what it actually change, I mean, it codifies something that the city and the state both want into law, or at least I guess it does the opposite. It strips something out of the law. And so that's real. I think the message has been pretty clear at both the state and city level that there shouldn't be cooperation with immigration enforcement. And there was a directive from Chief Sean Barnes saying, if you come across immigration enforcement, don't get in the way, but also don't help.
Yeah.
So, I think as far as what it means day to day, not to mention, I don't know how, I'd heard Mike Solon of the police union on one of his podcasts be asked, how often are police actually encountering immigration enforcement? And he said, hardly ever. Of course, you can always take anything he says with a grain of salt, but I don't expect that to be untrue. So I think that's probably right that, at least so far, I don't actually think Seattle police are encountering, or,
Yeah.
or I don't know that city employees are actually actively encountering immigration enforcement all that much. So in some ways, it's preparatory, as a lot of
Yep.
things and a lot of conversations are in Seattle right now for what
Sure.
could happen based
Yes,
on what we're
yes.
seeing in Minneapolis and elsewhere. So, as far as what it changes on the ground reality, I think not that much, but it does kind of square up Seattle law with what was already Seattle policy and really Washington policy.
Yeah, that's the attempt here. I know Councilmember Lynn still had some questions about that, about how the laws actually matched up with the city change. So he abstained from the vote on this, from the committee vote. So we'll see what happens next there. But just a quick touch one more time on what's happening with the Seattle Police Officers Guild. Mike Solon there. This, of course, the union for rank and file officers. Solon really was pushing back on a number of these city directives from the mayor for SPD officers to monitor what ICE officers are doing, for example. Solon at the time called it a toothless virtue signaling rhetoric. He won't allow, as he sees it, the pitting of two law enforcement agencies against each other. I know Solon's stepping down from his role here in the month of February, but his influence is very strong at SPOG and with these officers here. I'm trying to figure out what he's saying, and with that in mind, will officers actually execute on this Rivera ordinance if it passes? It kind of makes me think of the first issue we're talking about with drug laws too.
Yeah, I saw him say that, of course, and then again, I listened to some of his most recent podcast appearances, both his own and I think with Jason Rantz. I think what this is more than anything is like a messaging battle more than a substantive battle, because, the directive from, say, Mayor Wilson was, if you encounter ICE operations, you should document it and report it. Mm-hmm. And that sounds like a change in some ways, but actually, if you ask the police department and you ask even Mike Solon, and Mike Solon said this on several podcasts, that's not actually really a change. They do that already, if for no other reason than they have body cameras on and dash cameras on. So it is by default, these operations are by default being documented.
They're doing that anyway, right? Yeah.
They're doing that anyway. And if somebody comes to a police officer and says, hey, I think there's something untoward happening over here having immigration enforcement, they will respond to that. So even Mike Solon said this directive is not really a change. And I think, I've heard from people in the Herald administration after I wrote a story about it saying, this is not really a change. And so what it comes down to is the way in which, I guess, it is being said. So that's why I say in some ways, this doesn't feel like a substantive fight actually that much between the two sides as so much as a messaging one. And so from a logic perspective, I think it's a fair argument if Mike Solon wants to make it that it's toothless and virtue signaling. I think that's a more square argument than some of the other ones he's made, which is like this is turning law enforcement agencies against each other, because in reality, it's not actually that much of a change in policy.
Yeah. Does Rivera need to change her message? Because I know she's sparred a little bit with SPOG publicly in some of her comments.
Well, yeah, her sparring has kind of come, and I think this is fair. The fact that SPOG presented its most recent contract as a victory over the socialists,
right,
kind of undermines, at least in theory, what the point of a bargaining agreement is supposed to be, which is that it's an agreement between two sides, not a victory for one or the other. So she sparred a little bit. At the end of the day, we know that Mike Solon, who is representative of the rank and file officers union, is a pretty conservative guy. He's attended events with Tom Homan, the border czar. He's spoken out against sanctuary policies. And again, this is his right to do this. Mm-hmm. I still don't think, at least so far, there's any indication that like the true on the ground policy, that there's actually like a super substantive argument happening between Mike Solon and the city council. It's just they are coming from this issue from very different places and ideological viewpoints. And so, of course, there's going to be some like kind of back and forth arguments, but there hasn't really come up with a situation yet where, say, officers are refusing orders or anything like that, or really that even the city or Chief Barnes is giving them orders that are all that different than what they were already doing.
All right, well, up next, time to celebrate a big Seahawks win in the Super Bowl. But how much of a win is it for the city of Seattle? Could it involve a slight pay raise for you? More ahead on Now Hear This. Well, a dominant win for the Seattle Seahawks in the Super Bowl this past weekend, crushing the New England Patriots 29-13. Really wasn't that close. A big win for the Hawks after a heartbreaking loss to the Patriots just about 11 years ago in the Super Bowl when Malcolm Butler intercepted what would have been a game-winning touchdown for the Hawks. And this is a victory for Seattle Mayor Katie Wilson, who made a friendly wager with Boston Mayor Michelle Wu.
But I think everyone knows that our Dungeness crab is what is really world class. And just like the Seahawks, they dominate from the first snap. So here's a little proposition for you. I'm so confident in our Hawks, I'm willing to wager some of our world-famous Dungeness crabs straight out of Pike Place Market. Are you willing to back up your Patriots with some of that Boston lobster?
So some lobster headed Katie Wilson's way, and maybe something sweet headed to everybody else in the city. David, I was reading a National Chamber of Commerce report that shows even last year, when Seattle was not in the Super Bowl, there was a financial impact of more than $224 million in the Emerald City here. People getting merchandise, going to games, going to watch parties. This year, of course, that's expected to be much more. And there was a peer-reviewed paper from 2002. I know I'm reaching back a bit here, but that paper indicates cities where there is a winning Super Bowl team see an increase of $140 in real per capita personal income. It's happiness dollars, David. Are you buying that? What do you think?
Yeah, I guess I buy that, if...
like more productivity or something like that?
Maybe more productivity, probably some impact on like collective wealth in the city, and therefore each individual tax burden goes down a little bit. Something along those lines. These economic studies, the economic benefit of a stadium or the economic benefit of a convention center or whatever it might be, it's all very obtuse. But you got to think that, like, for Pioneer Square, for example, even having 2 extra Seahawks games or whatever it was that are totally packed, and not to mention the Super Bowl, it's got to be good for them. So I don't know about $140, but I'll wager that it has some sort of broad economic benefit for the city and the people within it.
I like it. Yeah, I've seen psychic wealth. I don't know if that's really a thing, but there's a lot of great phrases being thrown around right now. I did want to look at this in a larger picture here, because I'm trying to look at, I guess, the message of the Super Bowl win, and I'm adding it up here. So you got this win in the Super Bowl, plus Seattle hosting some World Cup matches this year, plus the possibility of the return of NBA basketball. The league commissioner, Adam Silver, very recently met with Governor Ferguson. Silver says this year there's going to be a decision if and when to pursue expansion and potentially bring the Sonics back to Seattle. Is Katie Wilson about to become the sports mayor her predecessors wish they could have been? What do you think?
Yeah, this will be, in some ways, the funniest storyline of the next 4 years. Because we all know that Bruce Harrell was a big jock. He was an All-American linebacker. But, Jenny Durkin was quite the jock herself. She was a basketball player, at least through high school. I don't know if she played in college, but, a big basketball player, a big fan. I don't know about Ed Murray. But, and then we had Jay Inslee, who was, of course, this big sports guy. And so it's funny to have...
Mike McGinn, too, was a big hoops guy. He was all about
there you go.
Making the layups with both hands, former Mayor McGinn. Yeah.
Katie Wilson is not anti-sports by any stretch. And in fact, I've heard that she's actually a pretty decent soccer player, but no one expected her to be dropping a lot of sports analogies into her speech like having any basketballs on stage like Bruce Harrell did.
Oh, please don't do that. Yeah.
So the fact that, genuinely, I know she wasn't mayor when the Mariners made their run, but, they could make another run. The World Cup, the NBA, genuinely, she could be the mayor at the best time in Seattle sports history, and that I just find endlessly funny. I think she finds it funny too. She told me as much, that she never expected to be the sports mayor, but certainly would accept it. I think if she brought the Sonics back, even if she didn't have anything to do with it, if the Sonics came back under her watch,
she's a hero.
That's got to be at least like 5 approval points in her favor, even if she doesn't do anything. It's just being the circumstance favoring her.
Yeah, 90% showing up. That's for darn sure. I appreciate that. I did want to talk about another issue that is definitely near and dear to Mayor Wilson's heart, and that would be what's happening with social housing. So we touched on this last week. The city council this week, full council, unanimously passed a measure to fund voter-approved social housing. This is the mechanism to make sure that they're up and going this first year. I saw some interesting numbers in this latest report from the social housing developer. They're saying they're going to acquire 300 units this year and more than 1,000 before the year 2031. They're hoping to start construction of new units next year and then have 630 new units online by that year as well. I wanted your take on those numbers, David. It sounds like some progress here potentially this year. If they build 300 units, if they acquire these 300 units, I really want to see that happen. And then I guess I'm thinking about the bang for a buck, too, because as of this week's vote from the council, they're going to have $115 million in funds coming in this year.
Yeah, I mean, that was what their report showed the last time I reviewed it, around the time that they fired their CEO, which was, that said that they had their sights set on 6 projects, I think 4 acquisitions and 2 possibly for construction. that was honestly the argument Roberto Jimenez was making to me as to why he thought it was a bad idea for him to be fired, because they had these projects in the works and they were actually, despite some of the complaints of the board members, they were actually making fairly meaningful progress toward getting these things online. And it's not like, Tiffany McCoy has been the CEO for 3 weeks. So it's not not like she was the one who pulled these all together. So that was
right.
The argument that Jimenez is making, that they were actually moving in the right direction. And, these numbers, I think if they could bring on as much as they're saying in that short a period of time, that would be a good proof of concept for them, for sure. Mm-hmm. And certainly it would benefit them. I've been following them since their inception, and it has not been smooth yet.
No.
At the same time, they haven't been in a position where they can actually start bringing housing online. So if they can do that, I don't think anyone's going to particularly care about the drama between the board members and the staff. If they, if they're bringing on housing, then that's why they exist. So yeah, they have deserved some, I think, earned skepticism over the last year or two because of the slow start they got, the infighting, the firing of their CEO. But, if, again, it all goes away if they can actually get some people into homes.
Yeah, and I'm looking at this in light of another issue the council is taking up this week on Wednesday morning, dealing with challenges for the Office of Housing, because this was another report, a long one there. But the thing that jumped out at me, and I know we've touched on this before, but this amount of federal funding, the COC, or Continuum of Care funding, that goes towards low-income housing, it goes towards homelessness. It could see major cutbacks in 2027 and 2028. The Office of Housing is estimating in this report it'll be $18 million short of the amount it needs in 2028 to maintain and build the housing it's scheduled to be working on. It just kind of put it in black and white for me, David. But when I think about, I guess, what seems like some good news for the social housing developer, there's some real challenges for the Office of Housing and some of the traditional models the city has used to try to bring housing into Seattle.
Yeah, that's true. And, certainly $18 million is nothing to sneeze at. I will say that Seattle provides an enormous amount of money at the local level that has really nothing to do with the federal government. The budget for the Office of Housing for the last 2 years, it has been over $340 million, which is far and away more than it has been in its whole history. And so,
and they've relied a lot less on federal dollars as I've seen it there.
Yeah, exactly. They have the Jumpstart tax, they have mandatory housing affordability pool, they have the housing levy, and all of these are bringing in millions and millions. Mandatory housing affordability is declining, that is going down, but the other two are still providing huge amounts of money. And so, I think losing that money would be significant, and it is at a time when a lot of housing providers are really struggling. It doesn't spell the end of the Office of Housing or anything close to it.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about a little bit more land use and other issues involving renters here, especially. A new survey on renters is coming out here, coming from a renter herself in Mayor Katie Wilson. We're going to break it down on what's next. Well, ain't nothing going on but the rent with Mayor Katie Wilson. A report from the Capitol Hill blog shows us she has released her own renters survey, trying to help renters with, quote, rising rents, messed up utility billing systems, and junk fees. This, as she put it in a social media post. I wanted to talk about this, David, and what this move by the mayor tells you about where the city might be heading next when it comes to tenant-landlord relations. I know this took a little bit of a pause during the last council that we had in place. Now it looks like there might be some changes here. What do you see coming out of this renter survey that the mayor's talking about?
Well, I think it tracks with who she ran as, which is she's a renter. She lives in a pretty small Capitol Hill apartment. Part of the reason I think she did as well as she did and surprised a lot of people is I think much of Seattle forgets that the city is now a majority renter. More people in the city rent than own. That group of people is getting older and more civically engaged. And so I think that explains a lot of her success, not all of it, of course.
Yeah.
So it would track that upon entering office, she would want to do some more work around what it means to be a renter in Seattle. Yeah. Exactly what that ends up being, I don't know. The momentum in recent years has been, as you mentioned, away from kind of additional landlord-tenant regulation.
Right.
She was behind a lot of the laws that passed City Hall as an advocate. Now she's mayor. She's acknowledged a lot of the challenges in the affordable housing sector and just the housing sector generally. So how she approaches that, I'm not sure. She didn't promise a lot of new landlord-tenant laws exactly on the campaign trail. Mm-hmm. She talked a lot about affordability, of course. She didn't so much, at least not that I remember, talk in great length about abuses of landlords or anything like that. She just talked more and more about how expensive and difficult it is to live here. So
Right.
I would guess that whatever she collects from the survey will kind of maybe be fodder more towards what is it we can do to help ease the burden of being a renter.
Yeah.
But again, she was one of the primary voices in favor of passing a lot of landlord-tenant regulations, some of which have been kind of rolled back a little bit, and it would be interesting to see which direction she wants to go.
Yeah, and I'm interested in that too, because the city can't really mandate rent levels for these market rate apartments. They can do some things with the fees, et cetera, but there isn't too much they can do about those larger macro issues. I know we've talked about that before. Just one last touch on that, the amount of renters in the city of Seattle. The latest stat I saw was 56%, which seems like it's been climbing ever so slightly over the past few years here. That just seems like a really important constituency to Mayor Wilson. And I wanted to point out, too, she's actually doing what sounds like a bit of a campaign rally on Tuesday evening here with the social housing developer, celebrating what's seen as a win in terms of getting these city dollars coming in and really getting the social housing developer started. It just seems to me that in the background there, she's definitely cultivating that constituency of renters, just to put a final touch on it.
Yeah, that's true. And my guess is, if you look at who's voting, and I think there's actually data on this, who's voting is still majority homeowners, but who lives in Seattle is majority renters. So in some ways, you could actually make the argument that she holds an even larger constituency of people who support her than even voted her into office. Because I think of that 56%, a smaller slice of those people vote than of homeowners. Although, of course, the election was very close, I think she has a decent claim that she speaks for and is representing a pretty significant constituency in renters. And, frankly, this isn't... saying that you are going to try and help renters should not be interpreted as some kind of out there lefty progressive activism or something like that, because the reality is most people in Seattle are now renters, and it would be an abrogation of duties to not put some serious effort into what it means to be a renter in Seattle right now.
I was waiting to say abrogation, but you got to it first. Thanks, man. Yeah. I appreciate that. No, it's true. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, how the social housing piece kind of weaves in there too. But a lot ahead when it comes to land use and renting, especially when it comes to a renter like Mayor Katie Wilson. All right, David, it is time to wrap up here. I need to note it once again. We are roughly a week away from the start of spring training games for the Mariners in Peoria, Arizona. We're talking about February 20th, that first game against the Padres there. Is there one Mariner that you are most excited to see as the baseball season begins? I wanted to throw it out there. What do you got?
Well, I think the story of the spring will be Colt Emerson. Does Colt Emerson make the team? This wonderkind 20-year-old prospect. There's some comparisons to the year that Julio made the team. No one really expected Julio to make the team going into spring training, and then he did and won Rookie of the Year. So can Colt Emerson repeat that path? I hope so. That'd be fun.
Boy, that'd be great to have some more young energy there. And then this Donovan kid, not a kid, the guy, the free agent they picked up from St. Louis there. That's a pretty big addition at second base. No,
exactly, and that's why it allows them to give Emerson a real shot to make the team, but they don't depend on him. So I think it's a fun spring training because you can dream on possibilities without needing to rely on them.
I love that. There's a Mariners motto waiting to be written down. Thanks very much, David. That's great. Thank you, sir. And thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks to all of our patrons. Scott, once again, good to have you joining us. Be cool like Scott, folks. Find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Pledge $5 a month or more. Thank you for the support. Thanks for listening to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you are tuning in. Taiwan, once again, leading the world in downloads outside the U.S. Thank you very much. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. See you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2026.